The great hall stretched before Admiral Sarah Chen like a cathedral of judgment. 12 towering seats rose in a perfect circle, each one occupied by a being that represented millions of years of evolution and civilization. The air hummed with translation devices, turning alien thoughts into words she could understand, though she suspected some meanings were lost in the process. Sarah stood alone in the center, her blue uniform a small splash of color against the sterile white floor. Behind her, through the massive windows, she could see Earth's fleet waiting in the distance. Hundreds of ships hung in space like sleeping giants, ready to carry humanity away from everything they had built among the stars. The Vorthak Chancellor rose from his seat. His tall, thin body moved with the grace of a being who had lived for 3,000 years. His skin was pale as moonlight, and his large black eyes showed no emotion as he looked down at her. "Admiral Chen." His voice echoed through the chamber, somehow both soft and terrifying. "You stand before this council as the final representative of humanity. Do you understand why you are here?" Sarah's throat felt dry, but her voice came out steady. "Yes, Chancellor. We are here because the council has decided that humans are too dangerous to remain in civilized space." "Correct." The Chancellor's head tilted slightly. "Your species has been observed for 200 standard years since first contact. In that time, you have proven to be problematic." A holographic display appeared in the air between them. Images flashed by. Human soldiers fighting alongside alien allies, human doctors working in refugee camps, human engineers building impossible structures on distant worlds. "You form emotional attachments too easily," spoke the Zephyrian delegate, her voice like crystal chimes. "Your people cannot maintain proper diplomatic distance. You weep for strangers. You risk your lives for beings you have never met. You are unpredictable," added the Krex ambassador, his scarred face twisting with disgust. "Your battle tactics make no sense. You charge into fights you cannot win. You refuse to surrender when logic demands it. Most concerning of all," the Chancellor continued, "you spread this contamination to other species. Aliens who work with humans begin to show these same irrational behaviors. They start to question established order. They act on impulse rather than careful calculation." Sarah felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced it down. "We call those things friendship, courage, and hope. You call them virtues. We call them chaos." The Chancellor gestured, and new images appeared. "Observe the evidence." The hologram showed a human medical team on Kepler Station during the plague of 2381. Sarah watched human doctors working for 72 hours straight, refusing to rest while alien patients died. She saw human nurses holding the hands of dying creatures whose names they could not even pronounce. Dr. Martinez collapsed from exhaustion, the Zephyrian delegate said. She had no logical reason to continue working past her physical limits. The Kepler natives were not her responsibility, yet she nearly killed herself trying to save them. Another image, human peacekeepers on Rigel 7th, standing between two warring alien factions. Captain Torres and his team refused direct orders to withdraw. The Krex ambassador snarled. They stayed in the combat zone to protect civilian refugees. 17 humans died because they would not abandon aliens they barely knew. "These actions make no sense," the Chancellor said. "Your people consistently choose the welfare of others over your own safety and interests. This is not how civilized beings behave." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "We saved those people. We stopped wars. We brought hope to places that had none. You brought chaos." The Chancellor's voice remained calm, which somehow made it worse. "Since humans joined the galactic community, we have seen a 30% increase in unauthorized interventions in local conflicts. Other species now question orders from their superiors. They form what you call friendships across species lines, leading to compromised loyalties. Even worse," the ethereal conclave representative whispered, her form barely visible as energy and light. "Your art and music spread through our networks like a virus. Young beings across the galaxy now create works that prioritize emotion over logic, beauty over function. They sing songs that make them feel sad for no reason." Sarah thought of the concerts she had attended on alien worlds, watching beings from dozen different species coming together to hear human jazz, human poetry, human stories. She remembered the tears in alien eyes during a performance of Mozart's Requiem. The way they had all understood something beautiful even if they could not explain it. "You consider these things problems," she said quietly. "We consider them gifts. Gifts that threaten the stability of our civilization." The Chancellor stood, his full height casting a shadow over her. For 2,000 years, the galaxy has known peace through order. Each species in their place, following their nature, maintaining proper boundaries. You humans blur those boundaries. You make others question everything. The judgment was already decided, Sarah realized. This was not a trial, but a formality. They had made up their minds long ago. The decision of this council is final, the Chancellor announced. Humanity will be relocated beyond the outer rim, to territories outside of civilized space. You have 30 standard cycles to gather your people and depart. All human colonies within our borders will be evacuated. All humans serving in alien organizations will be transferred to human command. What about the mixed stations? Sarah asked. The research projects? The joint colonies where humans and aliens live together. They will be reorganized according to proper species separation protocols, the Zephyrian delegate said. It will be more efficient this way. Sarah looked around the circle of alien faces. Some showed satisfaction, others uncertainty, but none showed the sadness she felt crushing her chest. They really believed they were making the galaxy a better place. You will comply with this relocation order, the Chancellor continued. Any resistance will be met with the full military force of the Alliance. However, we do not expect trouble. Humans have always been cooperative, even when it works against your own interests. Will we be allowed to return? Ever? The silence stretched for long seconds. Finally, the Chancellor spoke. When your species learns to control its dangerous impulses, when you can interact with others without causing disruption, perhaps the Council will reconsider. But we suspect that day will never come. Your nature appears to be fixed. Sarah nodded slowly. She thought of her daughter on New Terra, attending school with Zephyrian children. She thought of her husband's research team, half human and half alien, working on medical advances that could save millions of lives. She thought of the human musicians teaching alien students, the human teachers in refugee camps, the human engineers building homes on worlds that had never known architecture. All of it would end. We accept the Council's decision, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Excellent. The Chancellor seemed pleased. You may use all necessary time to evacuate your people safely. We are not cruel, Admiral Chen. We simply recognize a threat when we see one. Sarah turned to leave, then stopped. Chancellor? Yes? Your people will have their perfect order. I hope it brings you everything you think it will. She walked out of the chamber without looking back, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. Outside, Earth's fleet waited to carry her people into exile. They would go quietly, as they always did when others needed them to sacrifice. They would disappear into the dark between stars. Taking their chaos and hope and impossible dreams with them, the galaxy would have its peace at last. The Chancellor watched her go and felt something strange in his chest, something he could not name. He pushed the feeling aside. It was probably just relief that the disruption was finally over. He had no idea that what he felt was the first taste of the emptiness that was coming. 6 months after the last human transport disappeared beyond the outer rim, the galaxy settled into its new rhythm. The Galactic Council released statements celebrating the return to proper order. Trade routes operated with mathematical precision. Diplomatic meetings proceeded exactly according to ancient protocols. Everything was as it should be. Chancellor Vorthak reviewed the monthly reports with satisfaction. Crime rates had dropped significantly in the core systems. Without humans to complicate matters, law enforcement had become beautifully predictable. Criminals followed logical patterns, making them easy to catch and prosecute according to established procedures. The Kreks had even agreed to their first peace treaty in 400 years. Without human mediators confusing the negotiations with talk of forgiveness and understanding, both sides had quickly calculated that war was economically inefficient. The treaty signing had been a masterpiece of rational decision-making. Yet something nagged at the Chancellor as he walked through the council chambers. The halls felt larger somehow, though they were exactly the same size. His footsteps echoed differently, creating a hollow sound that reminded him of empty spaces. On Zephyrian Prime, Dr. Zelik stood in his laboratory staring at a half-finished project. The quantum resonance generator had been his masterpiece, designed to revolutionize faster-than-light communication. He had been working on it with Dr. Sarah Kim, a human physicist who saw patterns where others saw only chaos. The equations covered 3 walls of his lab, elegant mathematical formulas that described the behavior of quantum particles across vast distances. But there was a gap in the middle, a section that required what humans called intuition. Dr. Kim had always said the universe was not just logical but also artistic, that sometimes you had to feel the right answer before you could prove it. Zelix tried to continue the work alone. He ran thousands of calculations, built complex computer models, consulted with the greatest minds on his world. But every simulation ended the same way: functional but limited, practical but uninspired. The breakthrough that had seemed so close with Dr. Kim now felt impossible to reach. He had dismissed human scientific methods as sloppy and emotional. Now he wondered if emotion had been the missing ingredient all along. In the outer colonies, shipping lanes that had once bustled with activity grew quiet. Human cargo haulers had always taken the dangerous routes that other species avoided, through asteroid fields, past unstable stars, into regions where pirates liked to hide. They had charged fair prices and delivered on time, even when it meant risking their ships and crews. Now those routes were abandoned. The cost of insurance was too high, the risk calculations too unfavorable. Entire worlds found themselves cut off from regular trade, receiving supply ships only when the weather was perfect and the dangers minimal. Captain Vrex of the merchant vessel Steady Profit had always complained about human competition. Human ships would undercut his prices, take jobs he considered too risky, and generally make commerce more complicated than it needed to be. Now he had the shipping monopoly he had always wanted, but his profits were smaller than expected. With only safe routes available, everyone charged premium prices. Customers had no choice but to pay, but they also had less need for frequent deliveries. The economy was slowing down, becoming more careful and conservative. Vrex found himself nostalgic for the days when crazy human captains would take any job, forcing everyone else to stay competitive. On Sanctuary Prime, the great refugee world that housed displaced beings from across the galaxy, Administrator Tivek noticed the change immediately. The population had become quieter, more orderly, more sad. Before the human exile, Sanctuary Prime had been chaos. Human volunteers had organized festivals that made no logical sense, bringing together species that had nothing in common except their displacement from home. They had built community gardens where beings from different worlds could grow familiar foods together. They had set up storytelling circles where refugees shared tales from their home planets, creating bonds across vast cultural differences. Tivek had always found these activities inefficient. Resources could be allocated more logically. Order could be maintained more easily without constant celebrations and social gatherings. But now the refugee camps felt like warehouses. Beings received their daily rations, attended their mandatory orientation sessions, and waited in orderly lines for work assignments. Everything ran smoothly. Yet the suicide rate had tripled. The humans had understood something that Tivek was only beginning to recognize. Displaced beings needed more than food and shelter. They needed hope, community, purpose. They needed to feel like they belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was just a temporary camp on an alien world. Without human volunteers to organize activities and encourage connections, the refugees had retreated into isolated groups of their own species. The wonderful chaos of interspecies friendship had been replaced by efficient but lonely separation. Dr. Zekar, a hegemony psychologist, noticed the change in his patients across multiple worlds. For decades, he had treated beings suffering from depression, anxiety, and social disorders using proven therapeutic techniques. His success rate had been steady and predictable, but lately his patients described a new kind of sadness. They could not identify what was wrong, only that something important was missing from their lives. They dreamed of music they had never heard, colors they had never seen, stories that made them feel emotions they could not name. Dr. Zekar ran comprehensive tests, checked for environmental toxins, analyzed their brain chemistry. Everything appeared normal. Yet these beings were clearly suffering from a loss they could not articulate. He began to suspect the answer lay in the cultural archives. Before their exile, humans had shared their art freely across galactic networks. Music, literature, visual art, dance, forms of expression that prioritized feeling over function, beauty over logic. Most species had dismissed human art as primitive and overly emotional, but apparently some beings had been affected by it more deeply than anyone realized. Now, cut off from that source of inspiration, they were experiencing a kind of cultural withdrawal. The Chancellor received his first concerning report during the Autumn Council session. Ambassador Katara of the Ethereal Conclave spoke in her whisper-soft voice about declining birth rates across 17 systems. Young beings are choosing not to reproduce, she said, her energy form flickering with what might have been worry. When questioned, they expressed doubts about bringing new life into the current galactic environment. What specific concerns do they cite? The Chancellor asked. That is the puzzling aspect. They have no logical complaints. Peace has been maintained, resources are adequate, opportunities for advancement exist. Yet they describe the galaxy as feeling empty, lacking in what they call wonder and possibility. The Zephyrian delegate added her own observation. Innovation rates have declined by 40% in our research institutions. Our scientists produce competent work, but lack the creative spark that leads to breakthrough discoveries. They request human research papers from the archives, claiming human approaches to problem-solving were uniquely valuable. Humans were scientifically inferior, the Krex ambassador protested. Their methods were undisciplined and emotional. Perhaps, the Zephyrian said slowly. But they achieved results that we struggle to replicate. There is something to be said for approaches that combine logic with intuition, order with creativity. The Chancellor felt that strange sensation in his chest again. Stronger this time. The galaxy was functioning exactly as designed. Crime was down, conflict was reduced, efficiency was up. By every measurable standard, the human exile had been a complete success. So why did he feel like they had made a terrible mistake? Late that night, alone in his chambers, the Chancellor accessed the cultural archives and played a piece of human music, something called a symphony. The sounds made no logical sense, served no practical function, followed no efficient pattern. But as the music swelled and faded, he found himself feeling emotions he had no names for. Hope, longing, joy, sadness, all mixed together in a way that should have been uncomfortable but instead felt strangely beautiful. For the first time in 6 months, the Chancellor wondered what the humans were doing in their exile. Were they creating new music, new art, new ways of seeing the universe? Were they building something wonderful in the darkness beyond the stars? And for the first time since the trial, he wondered if the galaxy's gain in order was worth what they had lost in possibility. 18 months after the Great Silence began, the cracks in the galaxy's perfect order had become impossible to ignore. What had started as minor inefficiencies and statistical anomalies was now threatening the foundation of civilized space. The hegemony of rational minds prided itself on understanding the universe through pure mathematics. For 3,000 years, their calculations had predicted social behavior, economic trends, and political developments with remarkable accuracy. Their models were used by governments across the galaxy to make crucial decisions about everything from resource allocation to military strategy. But now their models were failing. Master statistician, Quomal stared at his screens in growing frustration. Every prediction was coming out wrong. Social unrest that should have been impossible was breaking out on peaceful worlds. Economic systems that should have been stable were collapsing for no logical reason. Even his models of stellar formation were producing errors, as if the universe itself had become less predictable. The variables have changed, he muttered to his assistant, Keptra. But we have accounted for all known factors. The human exile should have made calculations easier, not harder. Keptra hesitated before speaking. Master, I have been reviewing our historical data. Our models were most accurate during periods when human activity was highest. When humans were present in a system, our predictions improved by an average of 37%. Impossible. Humans were chaotic elements. They disrupted established patterns. Yes, Keptra said quietly, but perhaps our models needed that disruption. Perhaps chaos was not an error in the system, but a necessary component. Quomal felt his logical mind recoiling from the suggestion. Chaos could not improve predictions. Order was the foundation of understanding. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Without humans to provide unpredictable variables, their models had become too rigid to reflect reality. The pirates of the Chaos Nebula had also noticed the change. Captain Slagnor of the raider ship Blood Moon gathered his crew for what should have been a celebration. With humans gone, space lanes were poorly defended. Merchant ships traveled predictable routes at scheduled times. Raiding had never been easier, but easier had not meant more profitable. Where's the thrill in it? Complained his second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Krektos. Merchant ships surrender immediately. They hand over their cargo without a fight. No challenge, no excitement, no stories to tell. Slagnor understood the problem. Pirates were not just criminals. They were rebels against order, beings who chose danger and freedom over safety and compliance. Human ships had always fought back, forcing pirates to be clever, brave, and resourceful. Human captains would try impossible escape maneuvers, negotiate with clever tricks, or mount desperate defenses that sometimes actually worked. Now merchant captains simply calculated that resistance was economically inefficient. They filed insurance claims and moved on. Piracy had become as routine as any other business transaction. "The humans made us better pirates," Krektos said with surprising insight. "They forced us to earn our victories. Now anyone with a ship and a weapon can call themselves a raider." The quality of piracy had declined so much that even the Galactic Patrol was losing interest. Without the need to match human tactical creativity, patrol officers had become lazy and predictable. Crime fighting had turned into a boring administrative task. On the former mixed colonies, the transformation was even more dramatic. New Geneva had been one of the galaxy's success stories, a world where humans, Zephyrians, Kreks, and 6 other species had built a functioning multicultural society. The different species had brought their unique strengths together, creating innovations that none could have achieved alone. Governor Texera, a Zephyrian, had initially welcomed the removal of humans from her world. Humans had always been the source of most social problems. They organized protests, questioned authority, and encouraged other species to express individual opinions rather than follow group consensus. But 6 months after the last humans left, New Geneva was dying. The Kreks engineers, no longer inspired by human creativity, built structures that were functional but uninspiring. The Zephyrian scientists, without human intuition to challenge their assumptions, made steady but unremarkable progress. The ethereal artists, lacking human emotional expression to contrast with their own abstract forms, created works that satisfied no one. Worse, the remaining species had segregated themselves. Without humans to serve as bridges between different ways of thinking, each group had retreated into its own community. The wonderful diversity that had made New Geneva special was fragmenting into isolated enclaves. The spaceport that had once buzzed with activity now processed a few cargo ships per week. The research centers that had produced breakthrough technologies now filed routine reports. The cultural districts that had hosted galaxy-famous festivals now stood empty except for a few nostalgic tourists. Texara walked through the increasingly empty streets and tried to understand what had gone wrong. Everything was more orderly now, more peaceful, more efficient. Yet the city felt like it was slowly dying. The answer came to her while visiting the memorial park, a place where humans had insisted on honoring all the beings who had died building the colony, regardless of species. Other races had their own monuments to their own dead, but humans had created something different, a place that recognized shared sacrifice and common purpose. The memorial still stood, but no one maintained it anymore. Weeds grew between the stones. The eternal flame had been extinguished for efficiency reasons. The names of the dead were becoming harder to read as weather wore away the inscriptions. Humans had not just participated in the colony's success. They had been the emotional center that held everything together. They had cared about beings from other species as much as their own. They had seen connections where others saw only differences. They had built bridges not just between different technologies and ideas, but between different hearts. The ethereal conclave had noticed something else troubling. Their species communicated primarily through shared consciousness, experiencing reality as a collective rather than as individuals. For millennia, this had been their strength: perfect unity, no conflict, no misunderstanding. But lately, young ethereals were asking questions that had no collective answers. They wanted to know what it felt like to be alone, to make individual choices, to experience personal emotions rather than shared feelings. Elder Mystara found these developments deeply disturbing. Individual consciousness was considered a primitive stage of development that her people had evolved beyond. Yet somehow, exposure to human concepts of independence and personal identity had infected their young ones with dangerous ideas. "They ask about human concepts we do not have words for," she reported to the council. "Privacy, loneliness, personal dreams. They want to experience separation from the collective mind. This contamination will fade," the chancellor assured her. "Without human influence, your young will return to proper collective consciousness." But Mystara was not convinced. Some of her young ones had begun creating individual works of art, signing them with personal names instead of collective identifiers. They spoke of wanting to find themselves and make their own choices, concepts that made no sense in a unified consciousness. The humans had somehow shown them that being alone did not have to mean being isolated, that individual identity could exist alongside community connection. Now her people were questioning whether their perfect unity was worth the price of personal identity. Even the Galactic Council chambers felt different. Meetings proceeded with flawless efficiency, but they lacked the dynamic tension that had once made sessions productive. Human representatives had always asked awkward questions, proposed impossible solutions, and forced other delegates to defend their positions with more than just tradition. Without humans to challenge assumptions and suggest alternatives, council decisions had become predictable. They followed established protocols, referenced ancient precedents, and avoided any risks or innovations. The galaxy was being governed by formula rather than wisdom. Chancellor Vorthak called for the evening recess and found himself standing alone in the Great Hall. The magnificent chamber that had once hosted passionate debates about the future of civilization now echoed with the sound of routine business. Everything was under control, but nothing felt alive. He thought about the human Admiral Chen, who had accepted their judgment with such quiet dignity. She had not argued or threatened or begged. She had simply warned them that their perfect order might not bring what they expected. The Chancellor was beginning to understand what she had meant. Order without challenge was not peace, it was death. Control without opposition was not strength, it was stagnation. The galaxy had achieved everything it thought it wanted and discovered it was not enough. Somewhere beyond the outer rim, in the darkness between stars, the humans were building something new. They were taking their chaos and creativity, their impossible hope and stubborn compassion, and creating a society that the civilized galaxy would never see. For the first time since the trial, the Chancellor wondered if they were the ones who had been truly banished. 3 years had passed since the last human ship vanished beyond the outer rim, and the galaxy was learning the true cost of perfection. What had begun as minor inconveniences had evolved into a crisis that threatened the very foundation of civilized space. The plague started on Zerion 7th, a mining world on the outer edge of Krek's territory. The pathogen was nothing remarkable, a respiratory virus that attacked oxygen processing organs across multiple species. Under normal circumstances, it would have been contained within weeks by standard medical protocols. But the response was anything but normal. Dr. Vekhan, the chief medical officer for the sector, followed established procedures exactly. He quarantined the affected areas, distributed standard treatments, and filed reports with Central Medical Command. When the treatments proved only partially effective, he requested additional resources through proper channels and waited for approval. The approval process took 2 weeks. By then, the virus had mutated and spread to 3 neighboring systems. Medical teams arrived with cutting-edge equipment and carefully tested protocols. They worked standard shifts, maintained safe distances from patients, and followed all safety regulations. When their initial treatments failed, they consulted databases, ran computer models, and scheduled committee meetings to discuss alternative approaches. The virus spread faster than their deliberations. Dr. Lectra, a Zephyrian physician who had once worked alongside human medical teams, watched the systematic response with growing horror. She remembered how humans had fought the plague on Kepler Station 5 years earlier. Human doctors had worked without sleep for days, trying experimental treatments when standard ones failed. They had held dying patients' hands, spoken words of comfort in languages they barely knew, and refused to give up on anyone while there was still hope. Some had risked infection by removing protective gear to better treat critical patients. It had been medically reckless and emotionally exhausting. It had also saved thousands of lives. Now, as she watched alien medical teams maintain professional distance from their patients, Dr. Lectra realized what was missing. The current response was logical, efficient, and utterly lacking in the desperate human drive to save every single life, no matter the cost. When a young Zerian patient asked if she was going to die, Dr. Lectra found herself struggling to answer. A human doctor would have sat down, taken the child's hand, and promised to fight for her with everything they had. The promise might have been scientifically meaningless, but it would have given the child hope, and hope sometimes made the difference between recovery and death. Dr. Lectra could only offer statistical probabilities and treatment schedules. It was accurate information, but it was not enough. The plague continued to spread. not because the medical response was incompetent, but because it lacked the irrational human element that had always made the impossible somehow possible. Halfway across the galaxy, another kind of death was spreading through the great memorial archive on Sanctuary Prime. The vast complex had been built to honor all beings who had died in the service of peace: soldiers, medics, diplomats, and civilians from every species and conflict in recorded history. For centuries, the memorial had been maintained by a rotating staff of volunteers from member species. Each group brought their own traditions and perspectives, creating a rich tapestry of remembrance that honored different cultural approaches to honoring the dead. But humans had been different. They had not just maintained their section of the memorial, they had adopted the entire complex as their responsibility. Human volunteers had learned the burial customs of dozens of species, memorized the names of fallen beings they had never met, and treated every grave with the same reverence they showed their own dead. They had organized ceremonies that brought together survivors from different species and conflicts. They had collected stories from veterans and families, creating an oral history that preserved not just facts but feelings. They had somehow made the memorial feel alive with memory, rather than dead with history. Now the complex was maintained by professional staff who kept everything clean and organized according to regulations. The graves were properly tended, the records were accurately maintained, and the facilities operated efficiently. But the memorial felt empty. Retired General Kavor of the Krex military visited the grave of his former aide, a young soldier who had died saving civilians during the border wars. For 20 years he had come here annually, finding comfort in the human volunteers who somehow understood that grief needed witness, not just maintenance. This year he found only empty halls and pristine records. His aide's grave was perfectly maintained, but no one had left the traditional flowers that human volunteers used to place on every grave on memorial days. No one had polished the nameplate or spoken the ritual words that honored fallen warriors. Kavor tried to feel the same connection to his lost comrade, but the sterile environment made grief feel inappropriate, almost embarrassing. The memorial had become a museum of the dead, rather than a living place of remembrance. He left feeling more alone than when he had arrived. The crisis in innovation was becoming equally apparent across the galaxy's research institutions. The Collaborative Science Initiative had been one of the most successful programs in galactic history, bringing together the best minds from different species to tackle problems too complex for any single civilization. The program still existed, but its output had declined dramatically. Zephyrian logic combined with ethereal creativity had always produced elegant theoretical frameworks. Krex engineering paired with hegemony mathematics had solved countless practical challenges. But the greatest breakthroughs had always come from adding human unpredictability to the mix. Humans asked questions that seemed stupid until they led to brilliant insights. They suggested experiments that violated established protocols but revealed unexpected truths. They made intuitive leaps that bridged gaps between different approaches to understanding. Dr. Quintal, director of the Institute for Advanced Physics, reviewed the past 3 years of research output with growing concern. The work was competent, thorough, and utterly unremarkable. His teams were solving known problems with established methods, making incremental progress on predictable timelines. They were no longer making discoveries that changed everything. The human approach to science had seemed chaotic and undisciplined. They tested wild theories, pursued research based on hunches, and celebrated failures as learning opportunities. Other species had considered these methods primitive and inefficient, but somehow, human scientists had made breakthrough discoveries at twice the rate of their more methodical colleagues. They had found patterns that pure logic missed, connections that careful analysis overlooked, solutions that existed outside the boundaries of conventional thinking. Without them, galactic science had become safer but smaller, more precise but less profound. The cultural drought was even more devastating. Art, music, literature, and entertainment had always been dominated by each species' own traditions, with limited crossover between different aesthetic approaches. Humans had been the exception. They consumed and created art across species boundaries, finding beauty in alien forms and inspiring others to expand their creative horizons. Human music had introduced rhythmic concepts that revolutionized ethereal sound sculptures. Human storytelling had inspired Zephyrian poets to explore emotional themes they had never considered. Human visual art had taught Krex architects that buildings could be beautiful as well as functional. The loss of human creativity was felt most keenly by young beings across the galaxy. They had grown up with access to human art through galactic networks, developing aesthetic sensibilities that their own cultures could not satisfy. Now they created works that reached for something their societies could not provide, resulting in art that felt incomplete and unsatisfying. Master artist Zekmira of the Ethereal Conclave found herself studying human art archives, trying to understand what made them different. Human art was technically inferior by most objective standards. Their music was mathematically simple. Their visual compositions lacked sophisticated theoretical frameworks. Their literature was emotionally crude compared to ethereal, subtle consciousness exploration. Yet human art accomplished something that her people's sophisticated works could not. It made beings feel things they had no names for. It created connections between different species, different ways of thinking, different approaches to existence. It somehow made the universe feel larger and more wonderful than careful analysis could explain. Zekmira tried to incorporate human techniques into her own work, but the results felt forced and artificial. She could copy human methods, but she could not replicate the human heart that made those methods meaningful. The young beings of her species continued to ask for human art, human music, human stories. They wanted to feel the emotions that came from experiencing art, that celebrated individual consciousness rather than collective harmony. They wanted to understand what humans had called hope, wonder, and the stubborn belief that tomorrow could be better than today. But humans were gone, and with them had gone the art that made other beings dream of possibilities beyond their own cultural limitations. Chancellor Vorthek received reports of all these developments with growing unease. Every metric showed T5 years after the Great Silence began. The Malthari hive mind broke its centuries-old tradition of non-interference, with a message that shook the foundations of galactic civilization. The Malthari had not spoken in the council chambers for over 300 years. Their vast collective consciousness observed and analyzed but rarely participated in the messy business of multi-species politics. When they did communicate, it was through single representatives who spoke only when absolutely necessary. But on this day, every single Malthari in the galaxy spoke simultaneously. Their voices echoed from every Malthari colony, every diplomatic station, every research facility where their people worked. Billions of minds speaking as one, delivering a message that no one could ignore. The galaxy is dying, they said in perfect unison, not from war or plague or disaster, but from emptiness. We have watched. We have analyzed. We have calculated. The conclusion is inescapable. The humans were not the disease. They were the cure. Chancellor Vorthek felt the blood drain from his face as the implications hit him. The Malthari did not make statements lightly. Their collective intelligence was vast beyond individual comprehension, capable of processing information on scales that no single species could match. Explain, he managed to say. The Malthari representative in the chamber, speaking for trillions of minds, delivered their analysis with devastating precision. Birth rates have declined by 47% across all member species. Innovation has dropped to historic lows. Art production has decreased by 60%. Economic growth has stagnated. Social cohesion is fragmenting. Mental health indicators show increasing rates of depression, anxiety, and what your individual minds call existential despair. The Chancellor tried to interrupt, but the Malthari continued without pause. Most critical of all, the young of every species are choosing not to reproduce. When questioned, they report that they cannot justify bringing new life into a universe they perceive as empty, hollow, and lacking in what they term magic. They describe a galaxy that functions but does not live, that operates but does not inspire, that exists but does not hope. Ambassador Tvek of the Ethereal Conclave whispered, "The statistical evidence supports their claims. We have documented these trends but attributed them to temporary adjustment periods." "There is no adjustment," the Malthari replied. "This is not a temporary state but a permanent condition. The galaxy has achieved perfect order by removing the element that made order worth maintaining. You have created a machine that runs efficiently while its purpose slowly dies." The Krex delegate snarled. "Humans were chaotic and disruptive. The galaxy is more peaceful without them." "Peace without purpose is not peace, it is death," the Malthari responded. "Humans provided the element your species call hope. They believed in impossible things and made them possible. They saw potential in failure, beauty in struggle, meaning in sacrifice. Without them, the galaxy has become technically functional but spiritually dead." Chancellor Vorthak felt the weight of 5 years of growing doubt crushing down on him. What do you propose we do? Find them, the Malthari said simply. Admit your error. Ask them to return. The silence that followed was deafening. The idea of admitting they had made a mistake, of begging the banished humans to come back, was almost too humiliating to consider. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The galaxy was slowly committing suicide through perfectionism. The decision to launch a deep space expedition took 3 months of debate. The Council could not agree on the mission's purpose. Was it diplomatic outreach, scientific exploration, or acknowledgement of failure? In the end, they classified it as cultural exchange evaluation and hoped no one would ask too many questions. Chancellor Vorthak personally led the expedition, partly from duty and partly from guilt. They had no idea where to find humanity in the vast darkness beyond the rim, but Malthari calculations suggested probable locations based on human psychological patterns and resource needs. The search took 6 months. They explored dead systems, failed colonies, and empty space until their sensors finally detected something impossible: a cluster of inhabited worlds in a region that should have been uninhabitable. What they found changed everything. The humans had not simply survived in exile, they had thrived. But more than that, they had built something that defied every assumption about how civilized society should work. The first world they approached sparkled with cities that seemed to grow rather than be built. Architecture flowed like frozen music, combining functions with beauty in ways that made purely practical structures look like crude boxes. Ships moved through space in patterns that were efficient but also somehow joyful, as if their pilots took pleasure in the simple act of flying. But the most shocking discovery was who lived there. The human colonies were not exclusively human. They had become home to members of dozens of species, beings who had chosen exile rather than conformity, creatures who had been deemed problematic by their own societies, individuals who had never fit into the galaxy's ordered systems. There were Zephyrians who preferred intuition to logic, Kreks who chose cooperation over conquest, Ethereals who valued individual consciousness over collective harmony. There were pirates who had become explorers, refugees who had become pioneers, outcasts who had become innovators. The humans had done what they had always done. They had taken the broken and discarded pieces of the galaxy and turned them into something beautiful. Admiral Sarah Chen, now older but still strong, met the expedition at the edge of their territory. Her face appeared on the Chancellor's viewscreen, and her first words carried both sadness and hope. "We told you we would remain silent," she said quietly, "but our silence was never meant to be permanent. We've been waiting for you to remember what you lost." The Chancellor found himself struggling to speak. "Admiral, The Council. We may have made an error in judgment." Sarah's smile was gentle but knowing. "You created the perfect galaxy, didn't you? Everything ordered, efficient, predictable. Everything exactly as it should be." "Yes," the Chancellor admitted. "And it's dying." "Not dying," Sarah corrected. "Just sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it up again." She gestured toward the viewscreen, which now showed images of the human colonies. Children of a dozen species played together in gardens that bloomed with impossible flowers. Scientists from different worlds worked side by side on projects that combined art with discovery. Musicians performed compositions that blended the mathematical precision of Zephyrian harmonics with the emotional depth of human melody and the abstract beauty of ethereal consciousness singing. "We didn't build a human civilization out here," Sarah explained. "We built something new. A place for everyone who didn't fit into the galaxy's perfect categories. The dreamers, the rebels, the ones who saw beauty where others saw chaos." The Chancellor watched a group of young beings working together to build something that looked like a sculpture but functioned like a spacecraft. Their faces showed the kind of joy and purpose that had vanished from the civilized galaxy. "How?" he asked. "By remembering that intelligence without wisdom is just calculation, that order without hope is just control, that peace without growth is just stagnation." Sarah's voice carried the weight of 5 years of exile, but also the strength of 5 years of building something better. "We know we made mistakes," the Chancellor said, the words burning his throat. "The galaxy needs... You need what you've always needed," Sarah finished. "You need someone to ask impossible questions, to dream impossible dreams, to believe in impossible solutions. You need someone to remind you that the universe is not just a machine to be optimized, but a garden to be cultivated." The offer came slowly, painfully, wrapped in diplomatic language but carrying a simple message. Would humanity consider returning to civilized space? Would they help heal what had been broken? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking past the camera toward something the Chancellor could not see. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new kind of strength. "We'll come back," she said, "but not to the galaxy you built. We'll come back to help you build something better, something that has room for order and chaos, logic and intuition, efficiency and beauty, something that works not just because it's organized, but because it's alive." She paused, then smiled with the same quiet dignity she had shown 5 years earlier in the council chambers. "Welcome home, Chancellor. We've been waiting for you to find your way back to us." As the expedition prepared to return to civilized space with news that would change everything, the Chancellor realized that humanity's greatest gift had never been their technology, or their tactics, or their achievements. It had been their stubborn, impossible, beautiful belief that tomorrow could always be better than today. The galaxy had spent 5 years learning to function without hope. Now it was time to learn how to live with it again. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the sound of human laughter echoed across the void, calling the galaxy home.